You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. The Chinese Communist Party has made reunification with Taiwan one of its main political goals, but more unequivocal U.S. support for Taiwan has shaken up an already tenuous peace between China and Taiwan. And it's feared the Chinese Communist Party might speed up its plans to invade the island it claims as its sovereign territory. With Taiwan in the crosshairs, it appears the U.S. and China may be on a collision course as well. Lately, the tempo of stories from and about China has been frenetic. Just to highlight a few, Xi Jinping met with the Russian and French presidents. The People's Republic's posture toward Ukraine and Russia remains a murky guessing game. And the president of Taiwan met the Speaker of the U.S. House, Kevin McCarthy, reminiscent of former Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island last summer. In the backdrop, China has recently increased a show of might. It's a demonstration of just what a Chinese invasion of Taiwan might look like. And such a threat puts the U.S. in a bind because President Biden made it clear the U.S. would aid Taiwan in case of invasion. Are the two superpowers headed for conflict over what Beijing calls a renegade province? For all this and more, I'm joined by Joel Wuthnow, a senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs, which is part of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. He wrote a recent article in Foreign Affairs called How to Out-Deter China. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks, Ray. Delighted to be with you.
Well, with all the recent news, given what you said in your article and what we saw not long after it was published in the waters off Taiwan, can China still be out-deterred?
Well, I certainly hope so, and that's really the topic that's keeping the U.S. government, in particular the Department of Defense, busy these days. So we've been talking all day and all night about what we call integrated deterrence. And that means trying to build military tools of power along with diplomatic and economic tools, and in particular coordination with U.S. allies in order to impose such huge costs on any use of force by the Chinese that they're not going to try to go down that road in the first place. And so that's, I think, where our effort is. And I think if we're looking from today's point of view, I think there's a pretty good chance of success.
How was this latest show of force and the public statements from Beijing around it different from what's happened in the past?
Well, recently, and when I say recently, over about the last year or so, we've seen a much higher level of Chinese military activity around Taiwan. And so that means both aircraft that are coming pretty close to Taiwan, it means ships that are coming pretty close to Taiwan, and it means exercises that they're publicizing more frequently than they used to. And so all of this is really about psychological pressure on the Taiwanese themselves, on their leadership, and on the United States as well, to try to convince us not to cooperate, to encourage, from China's point of view, Taiwan independence. So again, we've seen a much greater level of Chinese military activity. But if we're talking most recently about their reaction to the meeting between Kevin McCarthy and President Tsai, that's actually been somewhat less intense than their response to when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan back at the end of August. So I think that also gives some evidence that the Chinese aren't yet prepared to go to the level of risk that could actually start a war with us.
Is the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, simply a much better armed force than it was when some of the U.S. strategies and policies around Taiwan were first being framed?
They're much more capable than they used to, and that's both in terms of the hardware they're fielding. So just for example, their missile forces can reach much farther out into the Western Pacific, targeting U.S. bases, facilities, ships, and so on. And it's also part of their military organization. And so if we're looking 10 or 15 years ago, the Chinese had kind of an antiquated, almost Soviet-style military structure, totally ineffective for modern warfare. They've changed all that under Xi Jinping. And so their military command system today looks much more like the United States, which has been their model. And so if we're looking both at the hardware and the software, I think they're much better postured than they were a decade ago or more. Not to say that they're invincible, not to say that they're necessarily overconfident, but certainly much better than they used to be.
A lot of the commentary that came right after President Tsai visited Speaker McCarthy talked of this latest set of exercises as something like a dress rehearsal for the invasion of Taiwan. And there's also been heightened rhetoric, and this time backed up with guns and ammo from Xi Jinping. Does it demonstrate a willingness on his part to take on risk, or perhaps a belief that China is now big enough, strong enough, and rich enough to go it alone if there is backlash against a military invasion of Taiwan?
Well, I think that was one of the main goals of this demonstration, was to convince us that it was something like a dress rehearsal and that they could be prepared to and maybe even willing to go one step further than that. So what you did see from a military point of view were exercises that looked somewhat like what would happen during a blockade, although not nearly at the same level of military requirements. So, for example, they weren't actually boarding foreign vessels, Taiwanese vessels or other foreign vessels, and they were actually conspicuously not doing that. One of the very interesting parts of this latest military demonstration was that at the outset, they said that they were going to start boarding ships in the Taiwan Strait. Ultimately, they didn't do that. And I think the reason for that is because they were trying to control the risk of where this would go. So they're trying to send a message to the United States, to Taiwan, to take them seriously. But they themselves, the Chinese, are also trying to moderate the risk because they don't want to right now get into an open conflict with us.
For all the rhetoric that was being tossed around, for a long time, it was understood that Taiwan didn't assert its independence or its sovereignty too loudly, and all during that time, the U.S. continued to tighten relations with mainland China while continuing to quietly sell Taiwan weapons for its own defense from a Chinese invasion, and it seemed like there was little interest in rocking the boat. That so-called ambiguity, China and Taiwan about their intentions, the U.S. about its intentions, worked for a long time, and then kind of all of a sudden seemed out of date. What happened?
Well, I think from the Chinese point of view, there has been sort of an inexorable trend towards greater clarity, both from Taiwan and from the United States about what our policies are. And so for Taiwan, now there is a president who is from the Democratic Progressive Party, more of a pro-independence leaning party. They're moving into an election season themselves. The front runner is also a relatively pro-independence leaning candidate. And then from the United States point of view, our own policy at a de facto level, so we say that we continue to support one China and all this, but the Chinese are looking at what we're doing in terms of selling arms, in terms of sending high-level political delegations to Taiwan and so on, and they say that you're not complying. So this is a fundamental danger from their point of view because this is changing the status quo and they can't accept it. So this is part of the equation. However, it's also the case, I think, that the Chinese bottom line is ultimately political control over Taiwan. So they don't particularly like where we are today, where we're headed. But from a long-term perspective, and long-term could mean decades, it could be by the middle of the century, ultimately their goal is to politically control Taiwan, not just simply to arrest Taiwan independence and U.S. support for Taiwan. I think what they're trying to do over the long term, meaning the next couple of decades, is to absorb Taiwan without having to use force. And that doesn't necessarily mean a nice deal, an economic deal, and so on. The chances for that are very, very low. But I think what they're trying to do is to put such a huge amount of psychological pressure on Taiwan, on the leadership, and also to, from my point of view, deter the United States from even contemplating intervening on behalf of Taiwan, that the Chinese can just simply absorb through threat without having to actually go to war.
One of the most frequently heard pieces of speculation about China and Taiwan is that Xi Jinping, even while proclaiming his loyalty and support for his friend Vladimir Putin, is really watching Ukraine closely for reasons much closer to home, you might say. That contemplating an invasion of Taiwan is not something you can do without keeping an eye on the world's reaction to the invasion of Ukraine. You've been watching the Beijing-Taipei controversy as it cooks much more closely than most. What do you think about that speculation, that Russia's invasion has at least postponed real consideration of a hostile takeover?
Well, it may have postponed consideration in the near term, but what I would argue here is that over the long term, it probably will put China in a better position and will lead them to be more confident. And the reason why I say this, First of all, China is observing the ability of the West to organize massive financial and other economic sanctions against Russia. And so I think now that's more on their front burner. They're trying to understand, well, what are our vulnerabilities to sanctions and what do we need to do now to inoculate ourselves against the most severe sanctions that the West will throw against us? And so I think they will make those preparations more urgent. Second, from a military point of view, they're looking at the almost debacle that the Russian military has faced over the last year plus in Ukraine. And so I think that will lead the Chinese to think, well, this stuff is actually very difficult to pull off in practice. But over the long term, that will lead them to look more closely at their military structure, their doctrine, and their training, and probably will push them to become more proficient. And then the last thing I would argue here is that Russia was successful in one respect, which was keeping the U.S. and NATO boots out of Ukraine for the most part, and also leading the U.S. not to get it to do a no-fly zone. And so how is that possible? And what I would argue is that that was possible because Putin put the nuclear card on the table at the outset and kind of scared everyone away from it. And so I think Xi Jinping will look at that and say, look, we ourselves are building a much larger nuclear arsenal, and that could be very useful for us at some point in the future in a Taiwan scenario if we can just simply scare the West enough so that they're not going to actively intervene on behalf of Taiwan.
I routinely, during this series, ask people to pull out maps because I want them to look at what we're talking about, because it becomes much more apparent and much more interesting when they actually take a look at the space. There was, in the aftermath of the 1950s Washington shouting match over who lost China and rising Cold War tension in Asia with a war in Korea, one that was developing in Vietnam, there was a strange back and forth in the presidential debate between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon over Quemoy and Matsu. And they're small Taiwanese-held islands, but they're really just a couple of 1,000 feet off the coast of China. There are signs that are posted on both sides of the water, propaganda signs that you can stand on the coast of China and read these propaganda signs on the Taiwanese islands and vice versa. And it almost seems kind of weirdly retro or quaint to be asking about Quemoy and Matsu in 2023, but I wonder why China has never seized these islands as kind of an appetizer to the main meal. They're so close to China.
Right. Well, from a military perspective, China can conquer them tomorrow if they wanted to. They're small, they're close to the coast. The defense could be overwhelmed pretty easily by the PLA. I think the reason why they haven't done this is that if you're going to complete half of the project of unification, I think what they would do would be to convince everyone else in Taiwan to get more serious about their own defense. And so if you remember back in 2014, Russia went into Crimea, and that was really a wake-up call. That was really the moment when the Ukrainians got very serious about their own defense. They started spending more, they started training more with the West and so on. And so come 2022, they were in a much, much better position to resist the Russians because they had that experience of being partially invaded. And so China, I think, would stimulate that. That would push Taiwan even closer to the United States and vice versa. And it would also result in some of the costs of a war. So in terms of the sanctions and so on, China would most likely have to kill people to do this. And by doing that, they would cross over a pretty significant threshold and invite international sanctions. So they'd pay some of the price of a war, they'd push Taiwan to reform itself, and they wouldn't actually get the main prize of the main island of Taiwan. So I think those are the reasons why they've held off on that.
Let's go back to last summer. The People's Republic was getting ready for Big 20, the 20th Party Congress. Cities were being spiffed up, soldiers were marching in Chinese streets, and Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. What was the calculation for the Biden administration? Because of the U.S. government structure and the separation of powers, Joe Biden couldn't order Nancy Pelosi not to go. She's been an irritant, a critic of the Beijing government for decades. So there she was in Taiwan, and it was like a thunderclap in the Chinese government, in the population, and they reacted heavily following the tensions around the Pelosi visit. There was a meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping where the two reportedly shared an interest in trying to lower the temperature. You kind of got the feeling She didn't want to invade right then. Biden didn't really want to defend right then. And both would proceed if they felt they had to. Why was that nod and wink between the two not very durable? It didn't even get us to the middle of the following year.
Well, I think both sides realize that they do have a common interest in stability. The Chinese are not prepared for a war or to absorb the cost of a war. And for the U.S., I think we have our own set of issues and we're trying to dial down the tensions. And so I wouldn't say that it's been completely unsuccessful. We've managed to avoid an escalation of tensions with the Chinese. The Chinese did respond, but they didn't increase their level of provocation after the McCarthy-Tsai meeting recently. And so I think, the tensions have been kept at a somewhat low boil based on a common interest. But I think the question will be whether or not they're going to remain at that level and where we go from here now that we're heading into our own presidential election season. To what extent will the Biden administration try to ratchet things up on China, or will they restrain themselves? And Xi Jinping now having full authority, having consolidated his power after the 20th Party Congress, he himself probably has a freer hand to do what he likes. And so will those calculations kind of moderating in the direction of stability, is that still going to be the case over the next year? And I think that's where questions start to take place about the willingness of both sides to stay out of a larger dispute.
Joe Biden, for his part, was less ambiguous than American leaders have been in the recent past, and said, yes, the U.S. will come to Taiwan's aid, though very little in the way of explanation of how and what that would consist of was offered. What do you think American support for Taiwan would look like if there was a kinetic attempt to incorporate Taiwan into China?
Well, recent polls have shown that Americans are increasingly willing to support some level of military intervention on behalf of Taiwan, and Americans are increasingly dissatisfied with China. So the baseline here, I think, would be an appetite to support Taiwan. However, in real circumstances, you start to become familiar with the real costs of a conflict. So will Americans be willing to accept casualties? Will the American public be willing to accept a protracted conflict with another nuclear armed power? What would be our willingness to accept the risk of nuclear escalation or attacks on our electric grids and so on? So once things start to become very real, I think that's where the questions start to occur. What are we willing to do, especially after having 20 years of conflict? Are we war weary? Are our sense of national interests higher or greater than they've been in other conflicts? And there, I'm not so certain. And that's why I think the Chinese are looking at us and saying we're potentially deterrable. The American public don't necessarily want to get into a conflict over an island democracy many thousands of miles away. The American public is war weary. Their resources are limited. American power is declining. And so what I worry about over the medium to long term is that the Chinese think that we can be warded off the scene pretty easily without the need to actually go to war against us. I think that's a scarier circumstance because from the Chinese point of view, that's the conflict they want. It's the one where we sit out. And if they convince themselves that we're going to sit out, I think they're more likely to pull the trigger in the first place.
You wrote a book called Crossing the Strait about this encounter and this controversy. It's only about a year old. Since it's been published, how have your predictions held up? Here we are in still the early months of 2023.
Well, I think the main conclusion was that the long-term situation looks pretty grim, especially if Taiwan doesn't do further reforms to their own military and so on. Whereas in the near term, we sort of argued that, China's calculus is not to get into a war when they're not quite ready for it. And there are a number of challenges for the PLA. And those challenges are ones the PLA is trying to work through and resolve. And so just an example of that, just a year or two ago, the PLA had no real way to get across the Taiwan Strait in the numbers they would need to land on and to seize Taiwan. They didn't have enough ships or airplanes. But they've been building them in the last year or two. They've been ramping up production. They've been doing things such as incorporating civilian ferries into their training so you have more capacity to get those troops across the Taiwan Strait. And so what we see is a real effort by the PLA to overcome those obstacles, and they're doing that. And so I think even though Taiwan, they're not going to wake up tomorrow and necessarily face the invasion, But there is a real threat. And so I think that should stimulate them to get more serious about their defense. And they may not have a moment like Crimea in 2014 to really give them a wake-up call. So I think they're going to have to look at what the PLA is doing and not be intimidated, but I think encourage more to spend more on defense and to work more on building the right systems to ward off a Chinese invasion threat.
Since the Reagan administration, it's been a cornerstone of American theory about the world that close trading partners don't make war on each other, that encouraging trade and economic ties builds down other kinds of tensions and also creates a mutual self-interest that acts against military activity. But here we are talking about one of China's largest trading partners, one of America's largest trading partner. Taiwan is an enormous trading partner of China's even. We're on the verge of, it looks like, a little bit of trade war, and we're also actually talking seriously about a shooting war. Is that old Reagan doctrine just not standing up to the pressures of this third decade of the 21st century?
Well, I think you're right to point out that we still have a very large and sometimes unnoticed large economic relationship with the PRC that, despite efforts by the last couple of U.S. administrations to decouple, has actually continued to grow, both in terms of trade and in terms of investment. So there is an underlying economic reality, and I think there is pressure on both administrations to keep these tensions at a relatively low boil from the U.S. business community, from certain states, from parts of the public that's benefiting from the trade, and even on the Chinese point of view, because they realize that we are part of their economic picture as well. So I think the economic picture, it does restrain both sides. We aren't actually in a war with the Chinese. But if they get to the point where politically they think they have to do this, or they think that militarily they're so well prepared and can keep the U.S. out of the fight, then the economic picture, I think that's a cost they assess will have to be absorbed. But, on the other hand, it's something that I think they are preparing themselves to deal with through national mobilization, through rationing, through systems, through diversification of their trade. They'll rely somewhat on Russia, on the global south, and so on. And so, again, it's part of the dynamic here. It's something that restrains, at least in the near term, but over the long term, you have to be less confident because you don't know if China is trying to inoculate themselves against the economic punishment that Russia, for example, has been facing over the last year.
Is the United States still a big enough player in all kinds of ways, soft power, hard power, diplomatically, culturally, influence, economically, that it's enough? You don't want to have to be on the wrong side of the United States, even if you're Xi Jinping, that having Lula in your corner or Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa or AMLO from Mexico, that doesn't add up to enough to make it worthwhile, to make it worth the gamble of really crossing swords with the United States.
Well, again, I think the example of Russia from a Chinese perspective has shown them a surprising, maybe competence by the United States to marshal our allies together and to pay prices. I mean, some of the European countries that were involved in the sanctions actually had to pay fairly significant costs with respect to their own relations with Russia. And so the Chinese are looking at that and they say, well, maybe countries that we thought would be neutral in a conflict like South Korea or India or Vietnam, maybe these countries actually would team up with the United States and do sanctions and reduce their trade and punish us in various ways. And I think that's worrisome to them right now, especially if they see U.S. leadership at play. But again, part of the issue here is that they're looking at this as a problem that they're trying to overcome. And so the Chinese aren't just sitting and observing this. They're also reorienting their own trade. I think they're trying to shore up their own supply chains. I think they're pivoting somewhat and solidifying their relations with the Russians. And they're trying to use their own economic weapons or tools with U.S. allies to try to at least keep some of these countries neutral in a future conflict in order to manage those risks. So today, I think this would dissuade the Chinese, but in the future, it's encouraging them to figure out how to overcome and defeat that, a sort of alliance coordination and cohesion by the United States.
Well, they are at the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs. You eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff. What should a rank-and-file American be watching? Someone who, reads a news source, listens to the news, just wants to be aware of what's going on. What should they be watching over the next year?
I think the main thing to watch would be not so much what Xi Jinping is saying, because a lot of his rhetoric is misinterpreted. So he talks about being prepared for actual war and real combat and so on like that. He's been saying these things for 10 years. I think what you want to look at is what the Chinese are actually doing down around their southeast coast. Are they just simply doing more scripted exercises? Are they just simply flying planes around in predictable patterns that's not going to create any real risk for them? Or are the Chinese actually doing new and dangerous things like trying to board ships or trying to, ram ships or shoot down planes? And so, are they actually taking greater levels of calculated risk? That would give you a sense of whether or not their calculus is changing. If they're just doing more scripted exercises or things along their coast and not coming in contact with anyone, I think that's where you start to say, well, that's for show. That's not really a sign of an escalation. That's really them being risk averse rather than risk acceptance. And so for me, again, it's really what are they doing? Are they accepting new risk? It's not so much what they're saying. It's not so much if they're doing old things. Are they doing new and risky things? That's what I would look for.
Joel Wuthnow, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Ray. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Our associate producer is Sienna Barnes. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Young is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.